Hello, Isaac. It's Friday, at least at time of recording. So I saw your video on Thursday, and I thought it was really thoughtful. And I guess, I wanted to respond to that, have my own reflections, and see where it goes from there. I guess what it kind of centered around for me was, I guess, that concept of identity, of self, of like the self narrative. And yeah, I think that I guess the Buddhists say, I assume that they often say something along the lines of like ego is ego and attachment, are the sources of like suffering and lot of the evil in the world. And I think this is certainly there's something true about that, let's say. And yeah, so I think like and introspecting critically and carefully about oneself is really important, and and it's a good sign, when someone does that. I guess like thoughts on that. Maybe one thought is like to start off from the very like philosophical root of like, I don't know, what it means to be a self. Not that I'm, incredibly well read on, lots of this like the philosophical literature, but I'll try my best to come up with things off the cuff, I guess. One thing that's always been interesting and maybe puzzling and whatever to me is like the idea of like stripping back layers, I guess, of like the self or like what it means to be a self. Because I guess like naturally speaking, we tend to identify, I guess, with our physical bodies. And like so my hand is me and my face is me and my voice is me, my brain and my thoughts are me. And so all of these things, it's like kind of the natural starting point. But then you kind of like maybe as we get older or as we, think more about these things, and then we're like, well, what if like, you lose your hand or something in an accident? And then what? Is like the hand like still part of you, like some sort of zombified remnant of you is like in the hand? And that's like kind of weird. We don't think so. Like, no, it's just now that's not you anymore. You are the rest of you. So it's like, oh, well, how much can you remove? Like if you remove the entire body except for the head, I mean, you wouldn't be alive for very long if that happened in the real world, but like, theoretically, like all of your your brain, like let's say you put your brain in a vat, and like that's still kind of you in a sense, like, and so the rest of this is like in a way you're thinking, oh, like, well, it's kind of like machinery, and that happens to house you. And so I guess yeah, that's like the physical aspect of stripping things back, but also just like mentally. I mean, we can think of like someone being like, I just wasn't myself. Or extreme cases where someone really, maybe because of a brain injury, or there have been cases where like brain tumors have affected like behavior, or at least we suspect. And it's like, and so to what degree was that person still themselves? And so, yeah, you get into that, and it's like, what is really at the core of all this when we kind of take all of the Russian nesting dolls away. We take them all out, and um, what's left, And I think this is maybe what gets at like the core of a core aspect of what maybe can be disturbing about this and ways in which we protect ourselves like egoistically is that at the core of that, there's almost nothing in a sense. Like all of the things that you would identify with as yourself, like whether it's being smart or being funny or being kind, or conversely being mean or being selfish or being, yeah, basically anything, any aspect of that, like you can kind of like be like, oh, well, it's just this part of your brain. Like if we changed your brain around so that like you had, I mean, I don't need to get technical, but basically, let's say you change the part of your brain that like is kind of like controlling for these it's controlling these sorts of like aspects. And you get a change in personality. It's like, so in some sense, again, it's kind of like, oh, well, we're inside the mechanism. And I think really, really truly what can be identified as a core is like the experiencer. So the one who, I mean, yeah, just like experiences the world. And like everything else is kind of, in some sense, like a shell around that in a way. The machinery through which that is perceived and moderated. And there's something disturbing about that because we identify a lot of like those things, as I mentioned, like being kind or being good, as like being integral to who we are, when in some sense they're not. Like at least science would tell us probably they are not. So that's like maybe like one thing. And that's like the like philosophical underpinning of this, perhaps. I guess like there is a lot of attachment for a lot of us, you know. It's very natural to attach to a sort of like a narrative about ourselves and like who we are. And I guess like, you know, that's the way we've been taught. That's like the hero with a thousand faces kind of thing. And it's very interesting to think about what sorts of narratives are like common. I mean, like the tendency for someone to like see themselves as being like above average or like things like that. One thing that I do think is very common is seeing oneself as a good person. And maybe this is because it's like important in my experience. Many people do have this as like some sort of like important value, and they also believe that they are, you know, good people. It's actually interesting that I'd one time come across like a study which suggested that many people don't have like the desire to improve morally, which is interesting, which either suggests that people like don't care, which you know, that's certainly possible, but I'm maybe a little bit less inclined to believe that, or that people believe that generally speaking, like they are good people. And I think that this is generally true. Like people want to see themselves as good people, and I mean they do strive to like act in such a way that is consistent with that in some to many ways, depending on the person. But yeah, like there's some degree of importance placed on seeing oneself as a good person and not seeing oneself as a quote unquote bad person, which is quite interesting. And there can be some experiences in life which challenge that, I guess. I mean, like for me, obviously, being like exposed to like factory farming stuff has been like a big shaker in that. You know, anything like we're taught from very early on about like the Holocaust, for example. And it's interesting to think back on like kind of some of the conversations and ideas that I was exposed to around that of like there was like kind of even when I was young, you know, and first learning about this, like still like a discussion around like who's responsible. Is it the Führer? Is it his minions? Is it the German people themselves? And like I remember hearing an anecdote about like an American meets a German on a train. The American's like, well, how could you do this or how could you let this happen? And the German responds like, yes, we did that. But think about your nation and like Wounded Knee or like all the sorts of things that we did to Native Americans. It's kind of like let he who is not guilty cast the first stone, and nobody ends up casting stones because everyone has done something horrible in their history. And that's like the thing. It's very interesting because you can kind of make an argument from these sorts of conditions, which is really uncomfortable. And I don't think that people have really resolved. I haven't read the essay itself, but I think Peter Singer wrote an essay which argued that by our conventional moral axioms, like most people are, the vast majority of people are evil. In some sense, it squares with like our ideas of punishment or like moral obligations and such, but it doesn't square with our perceptions as being good people who try to do the right thing. And sometimes history doesn't square with that either. And so in some ways, it's like the stories we tell ourselves are protecting us from that. And the thing to get into there is that the protection is not necessarily a good or bad thing, but it's more in the way that it protects you. In a way, like telling yourself that you are a good person and washing your hands of the deed is one thing. That's kind of protecting yourself by ignoring something. Trying to reconcile who you are with the processes that you're entangled with. I guess whether it be like exploitation, some sort of like exploitation basically in the modern world where things are genuinely quite complicated and like kind of asking yourself like what do I want to do or how should I see myself? I think that can be a more beneficent kind of self-protection. But yeah, I mean, I think that's an open question, you know? I guess like looking at it from a pragmatic perspective, what's the like most useful story to be telling myself? I think that is really important because I do happen to think that we are storytelling creatures, and I don't really think that there's a great way of like escaping from that. But I think maybe one thing that can help us is like if we can step back and see if the story that we have needs to be changed. So I think that that's a really useful thing to do every once in a while. Really nice and like self-aware. And hopefully like, you know, that kind of protects us from the complacency that like these stories can otherwise land us in. And then like maybe with like a final note on that is like that there can be like kind of the opposite in some ways, the opposite danger, which is what maybe what I've been concerned about, where you get so caught up in not getting got in some sense by your story that you become like a cynic, believing the worst about everyone and kind of being in that way protecting yourself from being disappointed, from being in some sense brought low by the fact that you are like deluding yourself, let's say. I think to some degree there's a value to worrying about that, but I think that when it's in that way, I think that it can be like let's just say, you know, harmful, damaging, because I think in some ways that kind of arrests progress because it just says, well, you're stupid or you're bad or whatever it is. And in some sense, there's the implication of there's no changing that. Yeah, if I just go around shouting on the street like, you know, for cause XYZ, you're a horrible person for not doing the thing. I think that's the message that people get. And or even if I tell that to myself, that's like the message that I might take away from it. And that might just be like, yeah, you know, I'm a horrible person. I'm still not going to do anything about it though. I've just accepted I'm a horrible person. And I don't think that that's helpful to anybody. And so I think it is like kind of, there's no easy solution to this, as in many things in life. And we just have to keep trying and changing and seeing what is better. What is the better story and how can we be better people? It's kind of like don't aim to be a good person, aim to be a better person. Was kind of how I think about it sometimes. Because no one's ever going to be perfect. We're always going to be failing at something. But just like kind of being better than we were yesterday, wherever we were yesterday, whatever we did yesterday. I think that generally speaking, that tends to work out fairly well. And at least at the very, very least, I don't think it's worse than what we have now. So yeah, that's kind of my thought on all of that. So yeah, thanks for making that video. And I love exchanging thoughts with you, and this like kind of triggers any sorts of new thoughts or topics or whatever. It'd be cool to like create like a thread or something. I guess let's see. What do I want to do for a song? Okay, so I figured out what the song will be for this video. And the song, the outro sample is going to be from Highwomen, which is by the Highwomen. Really great song, with a lot of nice philosophical themes. And I mean, also just life themes. So I hope you enjoy it. Peace out, my Fruit Loops, and I will see you around.
We're the Highwomen. We sing a story still untold. We carry the sons you can only hold.